Yeah, there we go.
Thank you. Sorry.
So what I'd like to now is move on to our next panelist, Christoffer Berger. He is a PhD fellow at the Department of Communication at the University of Copenhagen. His thesis work is on the emergence of new genres of communication in the intersection between personal and professional life. And his research interests also include the particular narrative strategies of the more fantastical genres of media. Christoffer, if you'd like to turn your mic and your camera on, start any screen sharing you've got, then
Yes.
over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that kind presentation. I'll just see if is my sound coming through okay?
Yeah, sounds fine.
Good. I'll try screen sharing now. Everyone brace yourselves. So, and I'll be sharing that one. Yes. And you should be seeing a lovely mountain view by now.
Yeah, we've got it.
And now you should be seeing my slides. So yes, thank you. Well, thank you for this very fine opportunity to present. I think it's a very exciting panel to be a part of, and I look forward to the discussions in the end. So I'd like to talk to you very particularly today about the movie Cloud Atlas. Some of you may be familiar with it or some not, fear not if you are not. As you might know, Cloud Atlas, the movie, which is based on the novel by the author David Mitchell, is sort of characterized by the fact that it intercuts 6 very different narratives which are highly separated in time and space, and which at the first glance seem to not really have anything to do with one another, aside from obviously being part of the same film and having some recurring actors. However, at a closer glance or a reviewing, thematic parallels between the stories reveal themselves and become very obvious. The stories, for one thing, all have a preoccupation with themes of predation, cannibalism, exploitation, imprisonment, and colonization more broadly. These themes play out across such varied settings as the Atlantic slave trade, a science fiction utopia based on human cloning, and a current era eldercare home, which is more reminiscent of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest than anything we might think of as actually caring. Aside from small references to one another across the different stories, the themes being juxtaposed in these different settings are what actually bind the story together. As the poster says, everything is connected, and I seem to have cropped that out of this particular image, but it says so on the poster. What I am trying to argue here is that Cloud Atlas is perhaps best understood as an update of the so-called Mythic Ages genre, a genre which has had some prominence in the era of silent cinema, but which has only arguably and very sporadically appeared since the advent of sound cinema, which was around the end of the 1920s, around 1927 and so on. And what do I mean by the Mythic Ages genre? Well, a comprehensive overview and genealogy of the Mythic Ages genre is beyond the scope of this particular talk, though I will try to put forth a working definition, which you might see on your screen now. I argue that they are characterized by the following traits. They juxtapose different plots playing out in different settings in very distinct time periods and very distinct locations. These may be told in sequential order, they may be told sort of in tandem, intercont, or occasionally they may be sort of embedded. So we have like one framing story and then a longer passage into another narrative at some point during the film. This is all in aid of emphasizing thematic parallels between the different plots and settings. What these films will often do, at least in their original incarnations, is they will often prime the contemporary or modern, as the case might be, setting as sort of the matter of major concern, i.e. whatever points we are supposed to take away from the other time periods are things that are sort of supposed to be reflected in the present of the audience. So the present era is sort of treated with the greatest severity whenever it appears. But however, they do gain their name from drawing upon mythic pasts. Sometimes this is in a very literal sense, in that they draw on religious stories, such as the Israeli exodus from Egypt in the Book of Exodus, or the story of the fall of man in the Garden of Eden in the Book of Genesis, so like a very heavy predilection towards biblical narratives. Other times, they mostly draw on settings that are easily recognizable historical periods, such as the height of the Roman Empire, or as you can see sort of on the bottom illustration here, some vaguely defined Flintstones era caveman times. So they also often underlined these parallels between storylines by having actors recur, often in very similar roles. So a person might play the male and female love interests of one another in different time periods in sort of parallel narratives, or the same actor might be playing the antagonist or sort of the stern patriarchal figure across different time periods. This is meant to signal to the audiences that these roles are supposed to be thought of as analogous to one another and sort of act as a shorthand, orienting the audience across these different time periods. They may include some sort of framing device which is set outside the narrative confines of any of the specific time periods displayed. One of the famous examples is sort of a father time figure opening a book, or in one of the more famous examples, which I'll get to in a moment, is this sort of image of a cradle rocking and sort of an eternal mother figure sitting by it, which is sort of a recurring motif in the 1916 film Intolerance. However, this is crucially like a framing device that if it occurs and isn't set in the modern day, it's sort of set in sort of a nebulous, metaphysical, outside of time itself period. So what are some more concrete examples of Mythic Ages film? Well, I've listed some of them on the screen right now. This is sort of the archive I've been able to compile of these films. As you might be able to glance, this is a genre film which we can mostly associate with the silent era of cinema, as I already mentioned. I have a number of speculative reasons for why this genre sort of went out of style with the advent of talkies. Most prominently, though, I think it has to do with these being a genre film which is heavily associated with certain directors, such as Cecil B. DeMille and Howard Hawks and D.W. Griffith, and even then only in very particular periods of these people's careers. Combined with the fact that they were never that successful as an overall genre in terms of box office, I don't think it's that mysterious that they went out of style. But then are rather interesting aesthetic reasons, which we may be able to get to in the questioning portion. Crucially for our purposes, however, this was a genre film which was recognizable enough to be the subject of parody. Here I'm thinking of the silent era comedian Buster Keaton's 1923 film 3 Ages, for which you can see the poster here. So this should tell something about sort of the prominence of the recognizability and sort of the codified nature of this genre as a whole. Like if you can make a parody of it, then it's recognizable. My comparison with Cloud Atlas is based on this particular corpus of films. I've sort of tried to compile it myself with inspiration from a number of sources, including Sweeney from 2007, who also is the one who offers up the Mythic Ages moniker. So the list is almost certainly incomplete. It relies on my own searches and queries, but it's, as best I can tell, the most comprehensive sort of list of these films that has ever been done so far. And these are the films I'm sort of comparing to Cloud Atlas and contrasting. So my aim here is to show that Cloud Atlas can be thought of in the context of these Mythic Ages films as both an exemplar and as a movie which very consciously breaks with many of the traditions of this genre. It breaks with many, if not all, of the sort of foundational aspects I listed on the pages before. And these are some of the ways in which that happens. So the recurring actors not only occupy very different roles and functions, so sort of a person being respectively the male and female love interests in one setting might not be in another, and sort of in a very narratological functions, actors don't occupy the same sort of functional roles. They sometimes even sort of cross the boundaries of genders and races, and this was of course a rather controversial aspect of the reception of the film for reasons that may sort of appear obvious to us in hindsight, but I won't go into them any further at this point. It's sort of the Cloud Atlas as a film also notably eschews any interest in the far-flung past. There are no flashback periods to the Garden of Eden. Indeed, there isn't even any time periods that are like set before the 1700s. Instead, the chronological focus is much more narrow. Its earliest setting is well within the confines of industrial capitalism. And this is, I argue, specifically to highlight how ideas such as racism and subjugation are in tandem with the developments that happen much later in the film, even into the two fictional future time periods, which the film also portrays. This brings me to another foundational aspect in which Cloud Atlas is different from previous entries. It's very concerted emphasis on the future. It includes, as I mentioned, not just one, but two very distinct future time settings, one dystopian, another post-apocalyptic. The apocalypse having happened sometime in between these two time periods, and as a very obvious result of the dystopia, the apocalypse happens. This focus on the future even goes so far as to extend to the framing of the film as well. Instead of having a framing which is sort of situated outside the confines of space and time, the film is bookended by the aging protagonist, Zachary, played by Tom Hanks. That's the character you see here in the middle bubble, in a very far-flung future but off-world setting, sitting around a campfire and relating the story to his grandchildren. It's sort of tempting to contrast this to other framing devices in Mythic Ages cinema, which situate sort of fatherly or motherly figures, so eternal mother or father time or something, as sort of the only authorial voices on the line here. Here, in contrast, the framing is in it's in a fictional setting. It's in a fictional, futuristic, off-world setting, but it is nonetheless as real as any of the other settings within the fictional fiction of the universe itself. It's a very diegetic framing as opposed to sort of a metaphysical one. It is the ultimate result of all the preceding events, the framing is. We are looking at the ultimate conclusion of all the centuries of exploitation right from the first frames of the film itself, even though we might not necessarily know it upon a first viewing. This leads me to my next point, that the Cloud Atlas very deliberately emphasizes the present in its structure, in contrast to almost all other examples of the Mythic Ages cinema. Not only does the present setting of Cloud Atlas take up very little of its runtime, it is also the most overtly comedic of all the stories. And therefore the audience members are primed to take it less seriously, and indeed it has the least impact on the overall plot, I would argue. And I think this is very deliberate. So in contrast, where previous Mythic Ages cinema Mythic Ages films were almost completely unconcerned with the future, Cloud Atlas is demonstratively uninterested in the present as a period of primary concern. The present is just another cog in the machine, so to speak. The frantic editing in which the 6 stories are in a very rapid pace intercut underlines this. The future is always already happening, and this is also underlined by the framing of the film, sort of embedded within this campfire narrative in the very far-flung future. This leads me to sort of a sub-point that this is also a very huge difference from the source material. The pointed focus on the future in terms of both screen time and structure is very much a product of the adaptation. This is sort of the work of the directors, the Wachowskis and Tom Tykwer. This is not sort of the structure suggested by the source material itself. Indeed, the other authors have argued that the source material, which follows more of a boomerang structure, sort of ending in the earliest time period, instead sort of suggests that all the terrible futures which are ultimately brought about might be sort of averted, and it's sort of like the extremely opposite point in the film itself. So the future is sort of inevitable. It's both the framing device and it's heavily intercut with all the present actions. And in this way, I think that Cloud Atlas represents a very pointed and marked difference from anything within the genre. I think it's deliberate, and it's a deliberate change which can be attributed to the hands of sort of the directorial team. On the other hand, however, and you can see sort of these are stills from the framing device I talked about earlier in the very far-flung future. On the other hand, while I have emphasized that Cloud Atlas breaks with the usual tropes of the Mythic Ages genre, it would be wrong to say that it completely breaks from the genre as a whole and sort of turns it completely on its head. And there's like at least one very significant point where this is the case. Firstly, while I have emphasized that it does much to dissuade both the usual ideas of either progress or stagnation inherent in previous incarnations, as well as the more, I've sort of called them the patriarchal metaphysic framings of other Mythic Ages films, the film Cloud Atlas still ends on a note which emphasizes well, very middle-class ideas of heteronormative reproduction. As one author has pointed out, it ends on a even though the final frames take place on a distant planet, it's still in a framing very much reminiscent of a porch and a white picket fence, sort of suburban life for the characters. This is a direct result of the conscious choices of the producers, who emphasize the ultimate reunion of two characters, Veronim and Zachary, who you can see on the frame here, as sort of part of the cohesive matter of the film. So although Cloud Atlas is rather revolutionary in its reliance on, for instance, science fiction as a genre, and in its insistence on subverting many of the tropes of, or at least structural underpinnings of the Mythic Ages genre, it still has some reminiscences in interesting places, mostly here in the both in this idea of finding cohesion within romantic unity in a less than obvious way, but also because the plot very heavily hits towards suggests an idea of reincarnation as sort of a theme of coherence. It's implied that the characters which ultimately end up as each other are reincarnations of two souls destined to meet one another through all the travails of time. Even so, this still represents a slight deviation or evolution from previous uses of the Mythic Ages genre, in that while there were certainly very metaphysical elements, but and sort of supernatural characters appearing in these, if they appeared, they were usually as sort of cohesive characters across the different time periods. They were usually either incarnations of abstract concepts, such as personifications of death, who would then very symbolically, but not symbolically, very literally appear across time periods. Or they would be, the most famous example is that there are at least 3 films which center on Satan as a recurring character who is immortal and therefore can appear across centuries in a variety of plots. But here, this sort of metaphysical or supernatural idea of dragging people across time periods is brought down to a level which at least has a human-centered focus, if nothing else, or at least is more bound to humanity. But I would still argue that Cloud Atlas clings to at least some of the metaphysical assumptions of its silent era predecessors, not totally leaning into any sort of science fiction aesthetic. So moving on to my concluding remarks, what I would like you to take away from this talk is that Cloud Atlas is perhaps best viewed as part of a corpus of Mythic Ages films, while in many ways being quite a radical departure from it. It still, however, maintains enough of the hallmarks of the genre to be recognizable and viewed as a suitable, and therefore viewed as a suitable contrast to the rest of the corpus. Perhaps the biggest takeaway I myself have from this is that we sort of need a more fitting term for this corpus of this genre of films than Mythic Ages, because that doesn't really apply here, even though it's sort of a very obvious comparison. And I don't think science fictional ages is a very good alternative, but I'm open to suggestions. An aspect which I also really didn't get that much time to dig into was what the choice of different time periods might tell us about the sort of genre constellations in which these different Mythic Ages films sort of appear. They all appear in different markets of genre films at different times, and how this sort of very consciously influences well, what time periods do we choose to depict or not? If Sword and Sandals films are in vogue, well, we need to have like a Roman setting, whereas if they aren't, we need to have something else, sort of as the period drama in there. I didn't have much time to enter into dialogue about that, but perhaps we can have that for questioning as well. Or it might be a subject for another time, but I hope I have, if nothing else, introduced you at least to sort of a new way of exploring a not all that successful film, but contextualizing it perhaps in the context of a genre of films which you might not have thought of before. That's it from me, and I would like to say thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing your comments and questions.